So, the last couple of weeks, we've really discussed a lot of the nonfiction works of the 18th century. And this week, we are going to take what those nonfiction writers have said about the quality of writing, about rationality and objective thought, about observation, and and the development of understanding and applying it to fiction works. So we have, especially last week, we looked at people like Jonathan Locke and Samuel Johnson, and we really get the sense that at least for an 18th century audience who was so concerned with rationality, of objectivity, that literature is not merely a means of imagination or escape or entertainment. Literature really is, during this period, considered a tool for the advancement of knowledge. And writers were often found observing nature in their attempts to express their beliefs. And remember, I think I said it's about a couple weeks ago, where we get a change in thought about human nature or man. Man is not inherently good as it was seen in the Renaissance, but man is this flawed animal that needs improvement. And this kind of human nature, this development of the man, was considered a constant that observation and reason could be applied to for not only the advancement of knowledge, but for making someone better. And within these circumstances, the age of satire was born. And satire really is, when you think about, or when people think about the 18th century, they often think of rationality and enlightenment, but also synonymous with the age is this development of satire. And last week we talked about wit, and last couple weeks we talked about wit and how this kind of definition of wit is this skillful wordplay and something that delights and shocks the reader. Is I mean, we think about it, I think, almost naturally today because it's from this 18th century world that we get our sense of satire with things like, I mean, we see it all the time with things like the Saturday Night Live. But anyways, satire was the most important popular literary tool that was utilized by writers at this time. And with the help of satire, writers were better able to educate, because remember, that's a big deal with the 18th century, educate the public through literature. And its function, which we'll talk about in a second, was to acknowledge a problem in society and attempt to reform that problem in a comical manner while still educating the public. And we talked last week that the 18th century was one in which exaltation of wit and reason come to the forefront of literature. And it's through keen observation and sharp nimbleness of thought that exposes superficial follies and moral corruption of society during this kind of neoclassical period in Britain. And we know that we have these concerns about logic and reason, of objectivity, this knowledge through observation, and especially this real concern with decorum and manners and morality, that kind of veneer, for lack of a better word, of social polish. But underneath the Enlightenment ideals of rationality, order, and knowledge, society embraced a pervasive obsession with decorum, a facade of established traditions and vanities, as well as an innate sense of moral and political supremacy. So, satire essentially is born from this kind of concern. And satires during this period aim to point out the shortcomings of society through ridiculing accepted standards of thought, exposing Britain's flaws, and chastising the hypocrisy of the time. And when we think of satire today, we think of it as poking fun of, but for an 18th century audience, satire really functions as a way to acknowledge a problem in society in an attempt to reform and in a sense of raising social awareness. Just to kind of illustrate to you the hold and the power satire had on not only the 18th century audience, but the 18th century authors. I'd like to illustrate by showing you some of the definitions and the comments that some of the great writers, ones that we have read, really focused and defined satire. And in Johnson's dictionary, Samuel Johnson, who we read last week, he defined satire as a poem in which wickedness or folly is censured. John Dryden claimed that true satire was the amendment of vices, and Daniel Defoe, who we'll read next week, thought that satire was a sense of reformation. And underneath, at the heart of all of that, is this kind of idea of improvement, not only of an individual person, but of society as a whole. And there are two great figures of satire that come from the 18th century, and those are Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift. They are the two most prominent satirists of the age, and I know that most of you are all familiar with Jonathan Swift, who we'll talk about in just a second. Aren't these two handsome men who are just looking at each other? So anyways, and Pope and Swift had their own definitions of satire. Jonathan Swift said that satire is a sort of glass wherein beholders do generally discover everybody's face but their own, which is the chief reason for that kind of reception it meets in the world, and that so very often are offended with it. And basically, he's saying that we can find folly or fault or vice in everyone but ourselves. And Alexander Pope, in his poetry, defined it as a sacred weapon left for truth's defense, sole dread of folly, vice, and insolence. And really, it is, satire is a kind of a weapon that both of these men employ in order to achieve some larger goal. So essentially, what I want you guys to think of as we read our works for this week is that satire, its sole purpose is to expose and criticize not only the foolishness, but the corruption of an individual or society. It exposes this kind of corruption through humor or wit. And essentially, satire at the heart of everything requires this element of wit and sarcasm, hyperbole, exaggeration, all of those types of things. Otherwise, it's not. It doesn't kind of create the irony or the laughter. And remember this kind of delight and surprise to the reader, this ability to as Addison would say, this ability to cut a man and still leave him standing a la Dryden. Those types of things are essential for satire to work. And these Enlightenment writers, um, Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, they use different mediums of satire, different types of logic, and different targets of ridicule in order to shine a light on separate aspects of British society, providing much needed criticism on the profuse moral corruption of society that sometimes seemed to forget the true ideals of its age. Pope and Swift are well known for their sharp, perceptive works. Both looked and both looked to rhetorical masters of the rational classical past and their separate satirical archetypes for inspiration. So there are two styles of satire that each of these men use, and they stem from these Roman classical thinkers of Horace and Juvenal. So Pope in The Rape of the Lock is Horatian in tone. And Horatian satire is humorous and intended to make us laugh at human foolishness or weakness. And in his poem, The Rape of the Lock, he delicately chides society in a sly but polished voice by holding up a mirror to the follies and vanities of the upper class. He doesn't actively attack the self-important pomp of the British aristocracy, but rather presents it in such a way that gives the reader a new perspective from which to easily view the actions in the story as foolish and ridiculous. It's really a gentle mockery of the upper class. It's more delicate and lyrical than his brutal counterpart, who's Jonathan Swift, who applies this kind of Juvenalian style where it's harsh. It's intended to make us angry at human vice and corruption. In his Modest Proposal, which is a quintessential Juvenalian satire, he shockingly reveals an often overlooked dimension of British colonialism with regards to the Irish through savage ridicule and disdainful contempt. It's a bitter attack with a morbid tale that shows the immoral and perverse solution to Ireland's economical woes using bizarre yet brilliantly clear logic and detached tone in order to attack indifference to the poor. He relies on realism and harshness to carry its message in a much more acerbic way than Pope does, by showing his ability to shock and ridicule. So there are two styles, both very different, but both very, very effective through their different vehicles. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to pick up with a little bit of background on both of these gentlemen, kind of essential background that you need to know before reading this week's work. And they'll give you kind of a background of not only the man behind the pen, but also the kind of background for the satires themselves.